When darkness abounds, when the way forward seems elusive, when the days seem burdensome and tiring, we consider where cracks of light beckon. The durability of hope nudges us to search for possibility, new beginnings, a way out of the chaos of crisis and fear. The spirit inclines toward repair and healing and reconciliation and leads us in search of resolution and restoration, a new heaven and a new earth, new wineskins for new wine. And so we ready ourselves for a pilgrimage. We pack nothing, we carry little. We burnt the old maps because they take us to the same places. We walk in a new direction. To walk in the footsteps of Jesus is, at the very least, to walk. This is a journey. We can't stay home. We're searching for those who live in the cracks of light, who may even be the bringers of that light. We go with hands open and minds open and hearts open. We just want to see the light that can pierce darkness. To ready ourselves, we assume newness. This is no time to carry the past as armor or argument. Unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, where is its life? So practice death and resurrection. Practice emptiness and openness. Practice receptivity and reciprocity. Amen. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's presenter. Robert Schentrup is the brother of Carmen Schentrup, one of the 17 victims of the Parkland school shooting. Since then, Robert has been working tirelessly on the issue of gun violence prevention with a myriad of organizations across the gun violence prevention space, focusing on youth organizing and policy. Robert also organized survivors of gun violence and advocates across the country through his organization, Zero USA, to work on policy around extreme risk protective orders and legislation to disarm domestic abusers. Robert first worked with Brady United on their youth program Team Enough as an organizing fellow, working to expand the programming with a focus on democracy reform, and he is now the organizing manager for the Team Enough program. Robert has been a significant contributor to our Preventing Gun Violence program that just launched this past Monday. So Robert, thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you so much, Jack, for the introduction. And it's wonderful to be with everyone here tonight. It's great to see so many folks here on the call. And I'm super excited to tell you about this new program that we've been able to help co-create. And on our meeting here today, I'm hoping to go through just some of the basics of what the issue of gun violence looks like here in this country. What are some of the protections that we have against gun violence in our national policy sphere? But also, what are some things that we can tangibly do about this issue? And tomorrow at Brady, we're actually celebrating a program that we've been running for the better part of almost 30 years called the Ask campaign. And on June 21st every single year, we have Ask Day, which stands for Asking About Guns in the Home Saves Kids. And it's about the importance and the power of safe storage for preventing gun violence of all types, but especially for protecting young people just like me and my colleague Hannah, who is on the call as well listening in, protecting us from gun violence. And so in my presentation here tonight, we'll go a little bit about what the issue looks like, what can we do, but this is just the tip of so many important pieces of information and potential activations available within our program that we feel so blessed to be able to put together with the folks at Just Faith and have it be a really powerful resource for you to go into your community, to go into your congregations, and be able to talk about what is honestly a hard issue to talk about. But it is something that is so important and really impacts all of us. And so I'll be using a PowerPoint today that I'm going to be sharing momentarily to guide our conversation, to help us understand a little bit more about Brady, about Team Enough, the work that we do. And we'll be able to then go into breakout rooms together, really continue to debrief on what our understanding of the presentation was, how it resonated with us, and of course, how we want to continue to take action. So as Jack said, my name is Robert Schentrup. I am the Team Enough organizing manager over at Brady, and Team Enough is our youth program at the organization. And so it's really focused on how can we activate young people, specifically young people ages 13 to 26, in our fight against gun violence. And at Brady, some of you might be familiar with our organization. We are celebrating our 50-year anniversary here this year. And our name Brady comes from our namesakes, Jim and Sarah Brady. In the 1980s, after Jim Brady was shot during an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan's life, where he was left with debilitating lifetime injuries, him and his wife, Sarah, joined the movement to prevent gun violence and helped create basic gun violence prevention infrastructure that we have here in this country. The Brady background checks and the original assault weapons ban being great examples. And since then, Brady has continued to move forward the work that Jim and Sarah really helped catalyze, working across Congress, courts, and communities, uniting folks who are gun owners and folks who are not, to be able to take action on this issue of gun violence, something that we all feel, something that impacts every American, and something that is a uniquely American epidemic. And so at Brady, we have a number of strategies to really move this really broad and hard to nail down idea forward. And so one of them is our legal team, which does great affirmative work, going after gun dealers who are negligent in their behavior, who are selling guns that are being trafficked again and again and again into our communities, along with pushing back against extreme interpretations of the Second Amendment that allow more guns in more places. We have a great team that works on legislative policy, which I work a lot in through our Team Enough youth organizing program. Our young people love to be involved within state and national level policy work that's happening, thinking about what are protections that we can put in place to prevent gun violence in our communities. Our grassroots are folks who volunteer across the country to help make these legislative goals and our goals across our programming happen. And so I help lead our youth grassroots through Team Enough. We also have a strong Brady grassroots network that comes from the Million Mom March era back in the early 2000s. And a number of our folks have been doing this work for 2+ decades and are really the backbone of our movement. But we have 2 new programs that we've started at Brady here in the last 5 years. One of them I'll be talking about today at the end of the presentation, called End Family Fire, really about the power of safe storage and having conversations with gun owners and non-gun owners alike to talk about what can we do to really make a difference. And we have our Combating Crime Guns program focused on how can we stop in cities and in states that have strong gun laws, how can we make sure that we're stemming the iron tide of guns that's flowing in from places that don't? And how can we make sure that we're fighting back and pushing back against gun trafficking, something that really impacts communities of color in particular. And so Team Enough, again, is our youth organizing program focused on educating and mobilizing other young people just like me, ages 13 to 26 in our fight to end gun violence. And so for our program, we are led by our executive council, which is a group of 15 young people across the country of this age demographic who have experience organizing on the issue of gun violence and really help, just like a board of directors would for any other organization, drive our strategy and our mission for the program. And at Team Enough, we know that as the generation of young people that is the most of color and the most queer of any generation, that diversity is a core component of moving forward this work in an equitable way. And thinking about gun violence, not only in thinking about, of course, the important role of guns, but also how guns intersect with so many other parts of our lives, especially on the youth side with our mental health, is really important for understanding how this issue comes together and what we can do about it. And so at Brady, we have something called the facts that make us act. And it's what are some of the key statistics and ideas that drive our work forward and that we really think about as we're interacting with policy, as we're organizing our constituencies. And so one thing that is really important, and is just a stat that stands out to me every time, is thinking about the enormous popularity of core gun violence prevention ideas. And one of them is the idea around background checks. It's something that we have now, but is limited in not every gun sale goes through a background check. But 97% of Americans want these expanded background checks because they've seen the power that we've been able to have from our Brady background check system today. Over 4 million people have been prohibited from purchasing firearms through the Brady background check system. And we need to expand that to every gun sale. And this policy is more important than a lot of things that are considered typically American. I mean, something that always makes me chuckle is thinking about how ice cream, something that is pretty universally popular, is supported by 95% of Americans, which I think is a little too low. But this policy is literally more supported than ice cream, than cheese pizza, than apple pie, right? These things that seem so universal in our life. And so the important power of not only people understanding how important these policies are, but also being able to address the epidemic of gun violence in this country that exists to a degree that is shocking to many people. I mean, we see here that every single year, gun violence is costing our economy over $229 billion. And this is just a number that's hard to wrap our heads around, but is really important for understanding, right, what this issue is and the problems that we're having. And so every single year we have some overarching stats on the issue of gun violence. And we see here in the US, every year, our annual number of people that die from gun violence is nearly 50,000 people. And this stat is just so much higher than what we think, but it's also core to understanding the way that gun violence is so pervasive in our society and the way that it's often normalized in a lot of the conversations and a lot of the ways that we move through the world. And this has meant that in the last couple of decades, more Americans have died here in the US from gun violence than have died in every war that America has been in ever combined. Right? This is all the way from our country's founding all the way to today. And it speaks to how the issue of gun violence is something that impacts us all in a way that other peer nations don't experience. And it impacts young people in particular really strongly. For young people, the gun homicide rate is twice that of the national average. And we see that in just a couple of years, the firearm death rate has really spiked for young people. And this is being driven by a number of factors, which we'll go into. But the way that we understand the issue of gun violence at Brady is as a public health crisis. And really what this means is taking what has typically been seen as a medical and epidemiological idea and applying it to an issue that really impacts us that's often seen as political. And we know in the data that gun violence is an extreme problem that we have in this country. But we also know that gun violence is preventable. Because when we look at other countries that are very similar to us, that have, and this is looking at countries like Germany and Japan, and thinking about what are the things that we have in this country that means our gun violence rate is 10 times, 20 times higher than theirs. The thing that we really see is just how easy it is to get a gun, leading to an oversaturation of guns in our community. The oversaturation of guns, right? We have more guns than people here in the US. We have 130 guns for every 100 people. How that enables so much of the gun violence that we have. And so in the small arms survey that we see here, this is from 2018. So this number has jumped a little bit, but we have way more guns than people in the US, and to a degree that is extreme in comparison to every other country. And when we see kind of, the rate of firearms per 100 people, when it comes to most of the other countries, it's somewhere in like 30-ish guns per person. But again, in the US, we have 120 to 130 guns per person. So just the level of firearm ownership is a really strong factor for how gun violence is happening. And that means that in America, we kill each other with guns 25 times the rate of other peer nations, right? And that is just a statistic that is really hard for us to wrap our minds around. But when we think about how gun violence is showing up in the news, how it's showing up in our own lives, the fact that 1 in 3 Americans know someone, just like I do, who's been shot and killed here in the US from guns, that it's the number 1 leading cause of death for children. And that has happened recently. This wasn't always the case. But in 2020, we saw that happen for the first time. And in the intervening years since, we've just continued to see it become far and away the number 1 cause of death for children. And so it's really important for us to understand, right, what is the scope and the scale of this problem? What are the ways that it's impacting all of us? But then also, it's important to understand what gun violence looks like. And one thing that we talk about a lot at Team Enough and at Brady is how different the pie chart of gun violence looks than what in reality versus what we hear in the media. And there is a really stark difference between the ways that we see and think of gun violence and the ways that it's actually showing up in our lives. And so we see here in a great breakdown from the Trace about CDC data that we often hear about in the media when we hear about gun violence of it being at a mass shooting, right? A shooting where multiple people are shot, often in a public place. When we look at what this pie chart looks like in totality, we recognize that when it comes to gun violence, that mass shootings are just 1%, in that there are so many more gun deaths that come from other types of gun violence. And the biggest one, 60%, is firearm suicide. And it's the number one driver of gun violence that we see. And when it comes to access to guns, that's really where we see this number of firearm suicides come from. How easy it is for guns to be accessible, especially to children, and how they can often lead to violence. We see that covered as well when we're looking at homicide, how it's a large contributor, especially interpersonal violence, to the way that gun violence shows up in our lives. And when it comes to the 60% number around firearm suicide, it's really important to understand it through the means itself in which someone is um, attempting suicide. And it's the fact that of all attempts, that guns account for just 6% of the ways that these attempts are happening, but account for over half of all fatal attempts. And so what we're seeing is the unique case fatality rate of firearms really impacting the way that suicide happens in this country and the number of people who die from suicide. And so in the US, when we're looking at the issue of gun violence, it's driven by two main factors. One of them is the oversaturation of guns in communities, and two, it's completely related to the first one, is how easy it is to access those guns. We know that every single year, almost 50,000 Americans are killed by gun violence, and that gun violence is the leading cause of death for young people, with suicide being a majority of that gun violence. And one thing that we didn't cover in the pie chart, but is really important to understand, is that law enforcement, when we talk about police involved shootings, they kill 3 times as many Americans with guns as happen in a mass shooting context. And so 300 people a year roughly die in mass shootings, but over 1,000 people every year, according to the Washington Post, are killed by law enforcement. And so when we're understanding what the issue of gun violence looks like, it's also important to understand how is it showing up in our lives dependent upon our identity, right? Who are the people that are the most impacted, and how does identity impact the way that you experience gun violence in your life? And while we just talked about the stat of how gun violence is the leading cause of death for young people, and that happened in 2020, it's been the leading cause of death for Black children since 2006. And so when we're talking about the Black community and how Black Americans are impacted by gun violence, we see it having an earlier and larger impact, leading to the fact that gun violence reduces the life expectancy of Black Americans by 4 years on average. How Black Americans are twice as likely to die from gun violence as white Americans. And this translates when we're talking about the way that communities of color in this country are uniquely impacted. Because we're seeing, especially in the Asian American community of which I'm a part, how gun violence is rising steadily here over the last decade in particular. And we've seen not only how hate crimes have gone up, but we've also seen how firearm suicide, especially among Asian American youth, has increased by nearly 200% in this last decade. And that's the largest increase of any ethnic or racial group here in the US. And we're seeing the spike in firearm suicide among young people of color across all communities. And so we see how, especially when it comes to the indigenous community here in America, how we have not only gun suicide rates, but also gun violence rates overall, more than doubling. We're seeing how homicide is uniquely impacting folks in Native American communities, and it oftentimes really intersects with things like the missing and murdered in a crisis happening, especially on reservations. We see intersecting with just the legal status folks in the indigenous community and how that interacts with our criminal legal system. And this connects to the experience of those in the Latina community here in the US. And just like for so many communities that are historically disenfranchised, we not only see hate crimes like the one that happened in El Paso, specifically targeting these communities, but we're also seeing the way that it interacts with systemic racism across this country, leading to the fact that gun deaths for those who are of the Latin community have increased by nearly twice the rate of gun violence overall. And we see that while there is very little information around kind of like the causes and the effects of gun violence, something that we're really digging into more now that we have the ability to have research being done for the first time in over 20 years. But we know that increasing safe behaviors around gun ownership is one of the most impactful things that we can do. And that's something that we're really going to dive in on here at the end of this presentation, is exactly how can we do that. But of course, with it being Pride Month here in June, one thing that is really important is to understand the way that gun violence is impacting the LGBTQ plus community, not only with hate crimes, but also the way that folks who are part of this community also have other pieces of their identity that intersect. And so what we see is that for Black trans women in particular, the rate of gun violence that they experience is 4 or 5 times that of other Americans, and even greater than for folks who are white and in the LGBTQ plus community as well. And so this idea of intersectionality, right, ways that different pieces of your identity intersect and inform the way that gun violence comes up in your life, the way that it can impact you, is really important for understanding who is impacted by gun violence and how it comes into your life. And one thing that's often not part of the conversation, but is really important for understanding the way that gun violence happens, is understanding socioeconomic status. In comparing it, and when we look at counties that have the highest poverty rates and counties that have the lowest poverty rates, we see how that really impacts the way that gun violence is being experienced. Not only with firearm homicide, which is 4.5 times higher in these low-income counties, but also in firearm suicide, especially for poor rural counties, where we see the overall gun violence rate, especially including firearm suicide, being higher than that of more densely populated urban counties. And so urbanization level, socioeconomic status, these are all things that impact the way that gun violence shows up in our lives. But the good news is, and we talked about this at the beginning, is that gun violence is preventable. And there are some things, not a whole lot, but there are some things that we have passed and codified in our law at the national level that help create a base for gun violence prevention that a lot of our work at Brady is about expanding on top of. And so the first one is the National Firearms Act that passed in the 1930s after Prohibition and after there was a lot of issues around organized crime, using things like submachine guns to really give a lot of state and local governments a hard time in being able to lead to infamous things like the Valentine's Day Massacre that happened out in Chicago. And the National Firearms Act was our first attempt as a country to really be able to rein in firearms that were uniquely dangerous. And so this act, and it applies even till today, makes it extremely hard to obtain a machine gun and has banned the manufacture of machine guns since 1934. And so while we do have an issue around assault weapons, this act for the last nearly 90 years has prevented these uniquely dangerous guns from being able to enter the civilian population. And since this law has gone into effect, there have been about 200,000 machine guns in circulation in the US, but they have not been used in an incident of gun violence against someone else or even themselves since that law passed. And so what we know is that when we increase the level of restrictions that we have, the level of responsibility, honestly, that we have for firearm owners, the level of gun violence that we have goes down. And when we look at our peer nations like Germany and like Japan and like Iceland that have relatively high rates of gun ownership, not nearly as high as us, Canada is a great example as well, that they have much, much lower rates of gun deaths per 100,000 people because of the strong ownership responsibilities around guns that they've implemented. Another important law is our Gun Control Act of 1968, which happened after the infamous murders of RFK, JFK, and MLK, really looking at what can we do to make sure that folks who are looking to hurt themselves or someone else can't own a gun. And that put in place the first background check system that was later expanded upon in the Brady background check bill in 1993. And we saw that bill really make sure that every gun sale happening at a gun dealer had to go through a background check, creating a system to bring together a lot of different information about gun sales to be able to help us understand how and why someone might not be the best place to own a firearm at that time, and building in things like waiting periods to make sure that folks who want to be a responsible gun dealer can and will be able to own a gun, but that if folks are in crisis or just not in the right time in their lives to own a firearm, that there's something that we can do. Um, and then after 1993, we stopped passing laws to address the gun violence that was continuing to grow in this country up until 2022. And in 2022, and you can see a lot of Brady shirts here in the background of this picture, we were able to pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And at Brady, we're really proud to have driven over 200,000 calls to members of Congress to really push for this first in my lifetime bill to really address the gun violence that we were seeing in this country. And of course, the shooting in Uvalde happening a couple months earlier really helped spur on this bill. But the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act did a number of things. Most importantly, provided money for violence intervention programming to prevent gun violence happening in communities, to be able to address a lot of the interpersonal beefs that lead to gun violence happening, and to make sure that we're supporting young people in communities who are struggling with issues around mental health, making sure that there was over $2 billion for schools and for communities to be able to provide that funding. But one thing that actually came out of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was recently closing the gun show loophole. And so this is a very infamous loophole around the fact that if you go to a gun dealer, you need to get a background check. But for a long time, up until this year, you were able to go to a gun show and get a gun without one. And very infamously, this is how the shooters at the Columbine school shooting got their guns. But just this year, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau announced that they were closing this loophole, and this loophole actually never existed. That when we're looking at what it means to be in the business of selling a firearm, that if you're selling a gun for money, that you need to have a background check conducted for that sale. And so this means that if you buy a gun at a gun show, if you buy a gun online, that a background check has to be attached to this transaction, and has allowed us to really close some of the gaps on background checks and make sure that folks who want to harm themselves or someone else have a harder time of getting a gun. But one thing I did want to mention, because it happened just a couple days ago, is a recent Supreme Court decision involving the Second Amendment. And we'll see here probably tomorrow another decision come down around another case, but this one was around Garland versus Cargo, and it was around the national bump stock ban. And I have a picture of what a bump stock is here, and without getting too technical, it's a device that you can put on top of an assault weapon that functionally turns it into a machine gun. And this device was used in the Las Vegas massacre that allowed the shooter to shoot nearly 10,000 rounds in less than an hour. That led to it being the deadliest mass shooting in American history. And yet, while this ban was one of the few things that had bipartisan support, was actually passed by Trump when he was in office, it was something that was just struck down by the Supreme Court not even a week ago. And it was said to violate this new history and tradition test that was set up in the Bruin decision that the Supreme Court had a number of years ago. And so this is one of the first things that we're seeing from the Supreme Court actually kind of interpreting this new Bruin test. And we're seeing how they're using it to strike down common sense bipartisan policy that they feel like goes too far against their interpretation of the Second Amendment. And so we are expecting to see a decision on another Supreme Court case called the US versus Rahimi here in a couple of days. But I wanted to also talk about, right, we've talked a lot in this conversation about all the things that are going wrong and some of the issues that we have when it comes to actually addressing guns in this country. And so importantly, I wanted to make sure we talk about, as this webinar is about acting for justice, right, what can we do to really make a difference? And one of those things involves our End Family Fire campaign. And the kind of term end family fire comes from the friendly fire concept from the military, really involving the fact that it's about describing deaths that came from misuse, that came from unintentional shootings in particular, but helping people understand that this doesn't only happen on the battlefield, but that this happens in our homes in America every day. And that we need to end family fire, right, where these guns are stored improperly and misused, because it's important for addressing the way that gun violence shows up here in this country. And so when we look at the problem of family fire, every day we have 8 children and teens unintentionally injured or killed by guns in the home. And so just today, there were 8 young people who found a gun that was loaded and unlocked and hurt themselves or someone else. And that means that over half of all, well, and one thing that really is impacted by this is the fact that as young people, the only way that guns come into our lives is when they're owned by someone that we know and that we love. And this leads to, when we're looking at gun ownership rates and safe storage behaviors, around 4.5 million children living in homes here in just the US where there are guns that are loaded and unlocked. And this means that nearly 90% of the suicide attempts that happen, like half of the gun deaths that occur, are around firearm suicide, where, and a lot of times it happens with young people, but we see with older adults too, where there is an easy way for them to impulsively take a action that leads to a really harmful behavior, and that it is the ease of access around these guns that enable these, especially rates of suicide, to be so high. And so at Brady, we've been able to put together this End Family Fire program to talk to gun owners and people who know gun owners directly and help them understand the risks of unsafe storage and gun mishandling to them, to their safety, to their family safety, and helping them understand how a lot of people, the reason they buy a gun is for protection, to protect themselves, to protect their family, and how storing a gun properly is what allows you to be able to protect your family and your loved ones as well. And so we launched a number of different PSA campaigns since we started the program in 2018, talking about how firearm suicide and unintentional shootings are really impacted by improper gun storage. We had a great campaign with the state of Missouri to help folks understand how safe gun storage helps prevent gun violence. And I know that here in just last year, we launched a number of campaigns to help people understand the importance of securing their firearm. And so the one of the biggest things that we're hoping to do is help people who own guns understand what it means to safely store them. And for a lot of gun owners, what we found when we were talking to them, and that this picture really illustrates, is that ideas of safe storage really depended upon where people lived and a number of their beliefs. And one thing that we found often is, well, I hid my gun, so I don't need to lock it up. Right, my child doesn't know where to find it. But when we did a number of surveys and focus groups with gun owners and their children, we found out that over 70% of the time, when parents were like, no, 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 my kid doesn't know where that gun is, they actually did, and that they were able to point out exactly where it was. And so when we talk about safe storage, we talk about the importance of locking up your firearm separately from the ammunition, and the importance of being able to make sure that that gun is disabled and protected from misuse. And these PSAs that we've put together to really help encourage these behavior changes have been videos, but we also have a number of different creatives that we've put on billboards across the country, on bus shelters, on buses themselves, I saw once, and really helping people understand, right, what happens when you safely store your gun and what are the results of not doing that. And we've been very lucky to work with the Ad Council, which is the group that creates all the PSAs that we see. So whether it's click it or ticket, or whether it's about being free from tobacco use, they have been able to help us create a really effective campaign to help address the issue of unsafe gun ownership. And so we saw here in the data that 140%, right, gun owners who saw this ads, who saw the ads that we put together, they were more likely to express concern that the gun in the home could increase the risk of a tragedy. And we saw that gun owners who saw these ads were more likely to seek out information on safe storage and to change how their firearms were stored and store them in a safe manner. And our model around these PSAs comes from an idea of wanting to expose people to these ideas, helping make them aware of the risks of not storing their guns safely, to shift their attitudes around safe storage and around what it means to be a safe and responsible gun owner, and then change their behavior to really fit that idea. And so, again, because this is an action webinar, I did want to pull out some things that you can do to help end family fire. And a lot of the information about how to do this and how to have these conversations are part of the program that we put together with Just Faith. It's something that you'll have an entire session actually to talk about with your small group and be able to workshop. But it's really important to learn about what are the safe storage programs and the gun laws in your area. I live out in Seattle, Washington, and we actually have a program in our city and in our county overall where if folks want to voluntarily put their guns in a safe storage location away from their home, there's actually access points across the county where they can do that. And this is great for people who might be going through a crisis period in their life, who might have a loved one who's going through a crisis period and they want the guns out of the house for that moment. And there are similar programs across the country. And so it's really important to learn about what are the gun laws and safe storage programs in your area, to, if you're a gun owner or know someone who owns guns, to practice safe storage, to make sure that your guns are unloaded and locked separately from its ammunition, to additionally ask people, your friends, your family, your members of your community, both your church or your geographic community, talk to them about the importance of safely storing a firearm and how it connects with them wanting to protect their family from harm, educating yourself and your community about gun ownership and gun safety. And one thing that you can also do is engage. And this is engaging your social networks. We have our PSAs that you can share out, but also engaging the media, making sure that these PSAs are getting played on your local radio or your local TV station, talking to your local advertisers about putting in education materials about safe storage and its power, on billboards near your local highway, on bus shelters, on public places where you can put information about safe storage, and making sure that more people know about the power of safe storage behaviors. And so Hannah, Tyler will from Brady will put in the chat our direct End Family Fire link, so that you can go and you can click in, you can watch our PSAs, you can look at what are the different programs that we've run, what is the impact that these safe storage programs have been able to have, and then how to take each of these engagement steps that we've outlined here, and how you can be able to learn, practice, ask, educate, and engage. And importantly, here tomorrow, June 21st, is the first day of summer. And we know when we're looking at overall trends that the first week of summer, so starting tomorrow, going all the way to next Friday, that is statistically the time in which we see a spike in unintentional shootings because of gun misuse, especially among children. And it's really because a lot of young people are home for the summer from school, and that's really where we see them oftentimes finding these unsecured guns and oftentimes harming themselves. And so it's really important, especially as we look at this summer, but also what we call Ask Day tomorrow, to if you are a parent or a grandparent, when you have your child or grandchild going and visiting someone's home for the first time, whether it's for a play date, whether it's for a gathering, or maybe even a meeting that you're going to for a club that you're in, that they're a part of, to ask, hey, are there any guns in the home that are loaded and not locked away? And just encouraging folks to right, have that conversation, because it's so important to make it normal to talk about the fact that most households in this country have a gun in them, or folks who have easy access to a gun. It's also really important to make sure that if you're a young person yourself, that there are a number of jobs that you can have that bring you into someone else's home. Being a babysitter, I did a lot of dog sitting in high school, and being able to say, hey, are there any unsecured guns in the home here that could be a risk to me? And making sure, again, that we're normalizing these conversations because there are too many stories. And I'm thinking of Kristen's song and Mike's song and their son, Ethan. And some folks might be familiar with their story, but Kristen and Mike, their son Ethan, was just 13, and he was going over to a friend's house to play over the summer. And what Kristen and Mike didn't know is that Ethan's friend knew where his dad's gun was stored, even though his dad had hidden it away, and that gun was loaded. And Ethan and his friend were playing with that gun, and Ethan was shot um, because there was a bullet in the chamber that they didn't know about. And Ethan later died from his gunshot wound. And in talking to Kristen and Mike, they say, again, I wish I would have asked, hey, is there a gun in the home that is loaded and unsecured? Um, and they're one of the biggest proponents for parents and families to make sure that we're asking about gun safety, that we're making it a part of the conversations that we're doing, and importantly for them also that we're holding folks accountable who negligently store their firearms. And so, I want to, out of respect for our time and our schedule, I want to kind of close there. The preview that I've done today, helping us understand a little bit more about the issue of gun violence, what we can do, especially around safe storage and the impact that it can have, is really just scratching the surface. There's so much more that we can learn about why gun violence happens, what we can do to fight back. In safe storage, practicing that behavior if you're a gun owner, having those conversations if you're not, is just one way to promote safety. And there are a number of different options and ways for you to engage outlined in our program, helping you understand with your fellow community members, right, how you can not only talk about the issue of gun violence, have engaging conversations around this honestly really sensitive topic, but then also providing you with the knowledge and connections that you need to really take action. And so, End Family Fire and that program and being able to help get these powerful PSAs out into the world is really important. But there's a number of other things that you can do as well. And one thing I actually want to call out is one of our chapters at Brady is out over in Maryland. And a number of them are people of faith who actively go to their congregation every Sunday. And one of them actually was able to talk to their pastor. And during this upcoming Sunday, they're actually going to be playing one of our End Family Fire PSAs during the service to help people understand who are part of that community and who might be gun owners, right? What are the risks of unsafe gun storage? And also, what is the power of being able to have these safe storage conversations? And so that's one great way that you can utilize these tools. But I really do want to shout out the Just Faith model. As someone who's an organizer, who's been working to get young people together for the better part of 6 years now, if not longer, one thing I've seen is the power of being able to bring people together and to take action with one another. Some of my closest friends are people that I've organized with. And the Just Faith model, building small groups, is the perfect way for us to be able to build the people power that culture change demands. To be able to change our world and our through how we're thinking about guns and the role that they play in society, but also in being able to help push for action at the legislative level and at even the local level as well. And so I just want to be able to close out here by, um, by thanking everyone. I want to thank you, of course, for attending tonight and for your questions. I'm really excited to hear a little bit of how the small group conversations go. Right? How are you digesting this? How are you thinking about the program? And then being able to be in Q&A with all of you. And so with that, Jack, I would love to pass the mic back to you and for us to be able to really talk in our groups about how this issue is resonating with us. What were some of our core takeaways and how we're thinking about taking action together?
Great. Robert, thank you. That was so very helpful, and we're just tremendously grateful for your being here tonight. So thanks. As Robert mentioned, we just launched our newest program, Preventing Gun Violence, moving from rhetoric to real solutions. That just released this past Monday. So let me just take a moment to share a couple of details with you. This is a program that was really prompted by our program graduates like you, who impressed upon us how important this issue is in their community. So first of all, thanks for the nudge. Second, thanks to Brady United, as you could hear from Robert, really an effective organization that's made a huge impact in this country. This is a program, as Robert kind of mentioned, that is intended for both gun owners and non-owners who are interested in reducing the regrettable violence that bad policy has resulted in. So here's my invitation to each of you. Bring this program to your church or your community. So it's one thing to get involved in a movement to stop gun violence, but bringing 8 to 12 people along with you makes your action 8 to 12 times more impactful. You don't have to be an expert on the topic or even have experience leading groups in order to be a facilitator. We will give you all the resources and all the training you need. And Heidi is putting the link in the chat for more information. I'll give you just a second to look at that. And so now we'd like to give you a chance to talk. We're going to break up into small groups for just 10 minutes. And Heidi's posting a couple of questions in the chat so you can chat together about tonight's presentation. So may I suggest that you introduce yourselves and then jump right into the questions. As soon as I stop talking, Heidi's going to send you an invitation to join a breakout room. So please join in, share some of your own experience, and we'll reconvene in 10 minutes for some Q&A time with Robert. Now we have the pleasure of chatting with Robert with your questions. Robert, oh, let me just mention again that if anybody has a question, just because we're a larger group tonight, if you could send your questions to me, and I'll be glad to try to find questions that sort of fit together and sort through whatever we receive. In the meantime, Robert, I have a couple of questions just to get us started until people send me some of their own questions. Here's a couple that I came up with. One was, I'm just wondering if you could comment a little bit why Brady was interested to collaborate with Just Faith on this module, and just anything you can share with us why that would be of interest to Brady United.
Yeah, absolutely. So why this partnership was something that really resonated with us so strongly was because we understand at Brady that the issue of solving gun violence is something that's going to take all of us. And we know that there are, within the work that we do, a long history of folks in the faith community being a strong part of our gun violence prevention movement. And there's a strong history of people of faith being involved in social movements across this country. And so as we're thinking about how can we be successful in our mission, how can we make sure that we are being inclusive, bringing everyone that is interested and wants to be a part of the conversation about gun violence and solutions. We know that reaching out to communities of faith and making sure that we are continuing to engage folks and spread the word about our work is really important to be able to make sure that we create the change we all want to see. Because I mentioned at the beginning, background checks and making them universal is more popular than apple pie, ice cream, and pizza. And yet it doesn't happen, right? It hasn't passed yet at the national level. And the thing there is really that we don't have the political power yet to make that change happen. What we're trying to do is talk to everybody we can to build that power. There are a number of limiting factors that are a little bit out of our control that have made it a lot harder than we would want it to make sure that happens. Having a whole bunch of money in politics doesn't help, but we do know that there's a lot that we can do to be able to build power together and be able to make sure that we can have these changes actually happen. And so, that's really why this work is so important for us. And why we're continuing to not only work with faith communities, but to talk to communities across the board. The number of schools that I've gone into, presented to classes, history classes, other classes at the collegiate level is another large part of that work as well. And we just want to help make sure that people understand the way that gun violence is happening in this country, what we can do about it, and that action is possible.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very helpful. Hey, Robert, somebody asked a question about, is there a good resource for just studying the Second Amendment for, the various ways people have interpreted it? I think just as a matter of becoming clear in their own minds about what the Second Amendment says and doesn't say. Do you have something you can recommend?
Yes, so there's actually a really good resource I'm thinking about around kind of Second Amendment interpretation that's really helpful. And that is written by former Justice John Paul Stevens. And it's really about the Second Amendment, his interpretation as a Supreme Court justice, how he sees the Second Amendment really being interpreted, and the and really his understanding of how we can make sure that we're interpreting it in a reasonable way that's in his mind very in line with what the founding fathers wanted to happen, and make it easier to actually pass gun laws through that interpretation. But really, the extremist interpretation we're seeing right now from the Supreme Court on what the Second Amendment means is something that is not natural. It's actually the end result of a multi decade investment by the gun lobby to change our legal system. And such a great example of this is a recent article from the New York Times that some folks might have read about a law professor at Georgetown. And it was investigative reporting into, he's a strong proponent of the Supreme Court interpretation of the Second Amendment as being anyone can own any gun they want at any time. And what this investigation found out is that he's been getting tens of thousands of dollars from the NRA through his entire career to publish these law review articles, to essentially fabricate this legal interpretation that then the judges that the gun lobby has given money to their campaigns can then reference in their decisions and create this new interpretation. And so the way that the Second Amendment is being viewed now is not the way that it was viewed in the first 150 years of American legal history, and is very different from what a lot of folks have thought for a long time. So I think John Paul Stevens' book is a really great example of a way to kind of conceptualize that framing, and is a resource I would highly recommend.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Another question that has popped up is the question about young people. A lot of your work has been engaging young people. Can you say a bit about your experience working with young people and their passion, enthusiasm, or maybe even disinclination to be involved? Can you just address that question generally?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I find a lot of times working with the young people is that there is a strong passion to make the world a better place. And we've seen growing up the way that gun violence has uniquely impacted us. I mean, I grew up with school shooting drills happening all the time. So many young people now, gun violence is something that is not an if, but a when. That we just feel like it's an inevitability that will happen. And a lot of us are really energized to do something about it. But I really do empathize with the young people who I've talked to and who I've met who just feel like there's nothing that we can do, that gun violence is just something that's going to happen and continue to happen. And I empathize with that because we haven't seen anyone do anything in 30 odd years, and up until recently. And so for a lot of young people, they're like, well, no one, it seems like no one's really trying. It seems like no one's attempting to make a difference. So I guess this thing is just something we all expect to keep happening. I guess it's just, it is what it is. And so, oftentimes that gets called apathy, but I really do think that for a lot of these young people, they've seen the adults in their lives, the people that they think are the ones that have their act together, who are acting in their best interest, not do anything about the issue of gun violence. And they rightly, I think, somewhat rightly assume that, okay, well, I guess that's just normal. I guess that's just the way that things are supposed to go. And so a lot of the work that we do at Team Enough is helping people understand, look, no, gun violence in this country is not normal. It's not okay. It's not been like this historically, and that it is preventable. There are things that we're doing that have a real impact, and we need to make sure that more of it's happening across the country.
Robert, one of the folks on the call tonight just observes that it seems to her that gun shows are happening more than they've ever had before, and she's wondering what's the motivation for this gun show now that a loophole's been closed up. Is this going to mean fewer gun shows, in your opinion?
It might. It really might. But it's the rule got changed in April. So it's still very early on for us to see. A lot of these shows have been planned for 6 months, a year in advance. But what it does mean is that at a gun show, if you buy a gun, that you're going to need to have a background check done for you to purchase it at a gun show moving forward. And so for some of these gun shows, they might decide that it's just not worth it. That they are not going to have the show. But actually, what we see is that a number of these people who are at gun shows are actually people who own brick and mortar gun stores. And so they're able to do background checks. And they usually don't do them because they want to make a sale more easily. And they don't want to know if someone might not be able to buy a gun with a background check. And so that's why they go to these gun shows. It's still very early on. I think when we look at kind of the number of gun shows here in 2024 versus 2023, we might have a little bit of a better idea. I think it's just too early on for us to really know.
Robert, is there anything more you can say about the sort of the socioeconomic connection with increased gun violence amongst poorer communities? Is there more that you can say about that by way of explanation?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I think that's a really important framing for specifically thinking about socioeconomic status and gun violence is just how core of a driver of gun violence it is. I talk so much about how if you are a person of color, how gun violence is so much more likely to happen in your life. But the number one driver, the number one determining factor of whether or not you will experience gun violence in your lifetime is, are you at or below the poverty line or not? And that is the thing that even more so than any other part of your identity impacts the way that gun violence might happen to you. And so it is extremely important when we're thinking about solutions to actively address the way the socioeconomics come into this. And one of the things that I think is so promising is how we're seeing more and more over the last 5 years in particular, strategies for prevention really just be about investing in communities, right? Building more parks, providing stronger infrastructure, being able to have youth jobs programs, being able to make sure that people who are a part of these community violence intervention programming, that a part of it is making sure that they have the money they need for the basics in their life. And that when we actively address the fact that socioeconomic status is such a big part of how gun violence happens and shows up in the world, we can meaningfully address why it's happening. And I really think, these CVI programs addressing homicide, particularly in urban areas, we've seen the promise of these programs just in the new FBI data that was released earlier this year about Q1, where we've seen, according to the FBI data, a significant drop in gun homicides here within the last year. And so there's a lot of promise to these programs. We've seen how when you really address what we call a root cause, socioeconomic status, when we address these root causes of gun violence, we're able to make a strong, significant impact. And so one of the things that I think has changed in the gun violence prevention movement here in the last 20 years is there was a hyper fixation on only the gun. But now in our movement, we talk a lot about, of course, the important distinction and difference in America is that we have a bunch of guns and other countries don't, and it's really easy to get one. But also, it is still important to think about, why is someone accessing a gun in the first place? Why are they making the decision to buy a gun? Why are they making the decision to purchase one and own one? And that's an important part of our making sure that we are providing a safer movement.
And Robert, this issue of socioeconomic status, does that extend sort of urban and rural? Is it kind of an equal opportunity problem? As we know, a lot of poverty shows up in rural areas, not in inner cities.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the issues around poverty that we see, especially in the rural areas, the way that it represents in gun violence is really the is really the large increase of guns and firearm suicides that are happening, especially in rural areas. And the way that these are deaths of despair in a lot of instances. And socioeconomic status is such a large part of that despair. And we're seeing it especially, I'm thinking of work that my colleague Anaisa does in Wisconsin. And the rural, really the dairy farmer suicide crisis they're having in the state, driven by the fact that a lot of these farmers are being bankrupted. In this case, a lot of times by big agricultural producers. But the way that suicide is happening is through firearms. And so there really are a lot of comorbidities here, but it affects folks of every walk of life, no matter geographic distribution, and socioeconomic status is a huge part of that.
Robert, thanks. Well, I have a bunch more questions, but I have some bad news and some good news. The bad news is we're out of time, but the good news is Robert's coming back next month. So just to let you know, Robert will return with his colleague from Brady United, Inez Asiyama, and they will together offer another presentation entitled Fighting Back Against a Rogue Industry, the important role of industry accountability in producing gun violence. So I hope you will join us again next month. And they'll look at the problem of crime guns in our communities and give practical ways we can join them in taking action. You'll receive an invitation to next month's event in our follow-up email with the link to the recording for this evening. Before we close with prayer, can I just invite us all to give Robert a silent clap, a Zoom clap in thanksgiving for his time and commitment to this issue. Robert, we're just very, very grateful. We look forward to having you back next month, and I'm excited to see that happen. Again, thanks everybody for being with us tonight. It was a pleasure to have you here. We're now going to close with prayer. This prayer also comes from our Preventing Gun Violence program. So let us pray. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me, on us all. Let our lives be invigorated by a fresh vision and unexpected energy to be healers, to be the bearers of good things, to be allies of love. Thy will be done. Let us be doers of thy will, agents of justice, and friends to those who've been betrayed, speaking truth to power. If there are parts of us that are scared or tired or paralyzed, and there are, give us new insights to dispel whatever is in the way of our next steps. New relationships await. New wisdom is waiting to be mined. New discoveries are there for the having. All that is required is a small yes to take a step, a gentle amen to God's beckon. The revolution will not be televised. You'll have to see it for yourself. You'll have to make it happen in your body, and you are the body of Christ. Gracious God, do not look upon what we have left undone. Your mercy forgives and invites. If we have ignored your invitations for fear or confusion, we only ask that your Holy Spirit empower us to be open to what is ours to do. Love's promise awaits. Love's promise abounds. Love's promise is ours. Amen. And again, thank you all for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure. See you next month. Bye-bye.